a lot of other local farmers around here, it was a major source of reliable revenue. For me, it's going to cost me around $150,000 a year.
$150,000?
Yeah, roughly 50% of my revenue.
While the cattle market has seen record cash trade, it has been the opposite for corn, with futures seeing some big losses last week.
I just think that these markets in general are really struggling to get any sort of positive information, I think.
The biggest factor that's pushed these corn back into contract lows is the market working in ideas of record U.S. corn yields, which could push ending stocks back over 2 billion bushels.
The United States has long been the undisputed leader in global corn production, consumption, and exports, with the fertile fields of Iowa, Illinois, and the broader Midwest forming the backbone of American agricultural power. But in 2025, that dominance is facing its most severe challenge in decades, and it's a crisis largely of Washington's own making. Tariffs and trade tensions, championed under a renewed wave of protectionist policy, have combined with evolving global market demands to create a perfect storm. And in that storm, Canada has quietly maneuvered itself into a winning position, capturing markets the U.S. once controlled with ease. While the U.S. struggles with trade wars and tariff disputes, one country is quietly emerging as the global leader in grain exports. Curious how Canada is outpacing the U.S. in the race for corn supremacy? Later, in this video, you will see how Canada's strategic approach is reshaping the agricultural landscape and leaving American farmers behind. The cancellation of U.S. corn orders by international buyers has become a significant blow to American farmers. As global demand for corn shifted, many international markets, including key buyers like Mexico and parts of Europe, began turning away from U.S. exports. This shift was largely driven by growing concerns over trade instability, particularly the impact of tariffs and regulatory issues surrounding U.S. agricultural practices. As countries like Canada gained a competitive edge with their ability to offer traceable, non-GMO, and environmentally compliant products, U.S. corn prices in the Midwest collapsed, and farmers were left with surplus stock. The cancellations not only hurt the immediate profitability of U.S. farmers, but also undermined long-term trust in American grain, signaling a potential restructuring of global supply chains. Canada, by contrast, had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of market shift. With its Prairie Trace blockchain system, Canadian exporters could verify every shipment from seed to port, providing proof of purity, low carbon scores, and sustainable farming practices. As the U.S. was caught scrambling to adapt, Canada's shipments were ready to meet the new demand. Within weeks, Canadian exporters secured long-term contracts with Japan, South Korea, and the European Union, worth billions of dollars. This was not luck, it was strategy. Canada had anticipated where the market was heading and built the systems needed to deliver confidence along with its grain. The trouble began when tariffs, aimed at punishing Chinese-built cargo vessels, triggered a ripple effect through the very infrastructure that moves U.S. grain to the world. Freight rates through the Gulf of Mexico surged by nearly 25%, raising export costs by hundreds of millions of dollars. Across the Pacific, container shipping costs doubled within weeks, rising to $5,000 per unit. For Midwest farmers already operating on tight margins, this was the first blow, a direct result of tariff-driven trade tensions. While the intention was to pressure China, the immediate collateral damage landed squarely on American agriculture.
Falling corn prices were already painting a poor financial picture for 2025, but fertilizer prices surged higher to finish June. With the corn to fertilizer price ratio now some of the worst in history, it's likely farmers will be spending more on fertilizer this fall.
These costs came on top of already high input prices for fertilizer, seed, and fuel, pushing many farm operations into dangerous financial territory. But the real crisis emerged not from the fields, but from the docks. By March 2025, the Federal Grain Inspection Service tightened its pesticide residue rules, raising testing fees by 40% and requiring every outbound shipment to meet a new chemical threshold. Failure mid-route meant costly returns. Barges on the Mississippi slowed to well below the 5-year average, and New Orleans turned into a floating warehouse of idle grain. More than 180 vessels sat waiting for inspection, paperwork, and scarce empty containers. Each week of delay shaved roughly 27 cents off every bushel's value. For farmers in Iowa and Indiana, those losses multiplied quickly, with many seeing their break-even point slip further out of reach. While the US struggled with regulatory bottlenecks and tariff-induced shipping chaos, the world's buyers began to adjust. Global grain markets were no longer driven solely by abundance. They demanded traceability, environmental compliance, and increasingly, non-GMO assurances. In February, a bombshell dropped. Mexico, a top buyer of US corn, announced a ban on imports of genetically modified corn. Over 90% of US acreage is planted with GMO varieties, instantly putting American grain at a disadvantage. Other markets, particularly in Asia and Europe, began adding similar clauses to their contracts. The consequences for US farmers were swift and painful. Spot corn prices in the Midwest collapsed to $3.45 per bushel, the lowest in nearly a decade and well below break-even levels. Meanwhile, Manitoba's corn fetched £4.20 per bushel, reflecting the premium buyers were willing to pay for traceability and environmental assurances. Contracts with Midwest cooperatives were cancelled outright. Silos overflowed as barges stayed anchored. Buyers who had depended on American corn for decades turned north without hesitation. This was more than a price issue, it was a structural erosion of trust. Canada's grain met the checklists of a modern market: clean, certified, traceable, and free of contentious genetic modifications. Every Canadian shipment reinforced a perception of reliability. Trust had become a currency as valuable as the grain itself. The US, burdened by tariff fallout and a sluggish response to changing standards, could no longer guarantee that same level of certainty. By late September, the USDA projected that 2.5 billion bushels, roughly 68 million tons, of US corn would remain unsold. In Iowa, growers were shouldering average input costs of $165 per acre. Many chose to halt harvest altogether, knowing the economics no longer worked. Some listed their equipment for sale, while others sought off-farm jobs just to keep mortgage payments current. In Indiana, rural economies contracted sharply, with the state's GDP shrinking more than 6% in the first quarter of 2025. Food banks saw a surge in demand, with over 130 million meals for low-income households at risk as surplus grain programs dried up. Through all of this, Canada's ascent continued with precision. Old crop basis prices in Ontario rose as much as $1.87 above Chicago futures. Even new crop sales commanded premiums of 18% or more. In March 2025, Canada and South Korea finalized an organic equivalency arrangement, allowing certified Canadian grain to bypass additional inspections at Korean ports. Ontario cooperatives signed 5-year contracts almost immediately. Saskatchewan followed with new supply agreements in Japan and the Netherlands, leveraging both a weak Canadian dollar and the tariff headaches plaguing US exports. Canada has been strategically positioning itself as a trusted and reliable supplier of grain, particularly corn, and is now reaping the rewards. While the US faces rising challenges with tariffs, trade disputes, and regulatory hurdles, Canada has excelled by aligning its agricultural practices with global demand for sustainability and traceability. Canadian corn, known for its purity and environmental compliance, is increasingly favored by international buyers, including those in Japan, South Korea, and the European Union. Canada's use of advanced systems like the Prairie Trace blockchain to ensure full traceability from farm to port has set it apart, allowing Canadian exporters to secure long-term contracts with premium prices. With a focus on low-carbon production and non-GMO varieties, Canada has gained a competitive edge, while US corn exports face rejection due to regulatory issues and geopolitical tensions. As a result, Canada is not only maintaining its presence in established markets, but is also expanding its reach, solidifying its position as a global leader in grain exports. Canadian institutions bolstered this advantage. Export Development Canada provided insurance for single-lot shipments and reimbursed costs tied to low-emission transport. Rail networks optimized routes from the prairies to Vancouver and even picked up US cargo at discounted rates when returning from Asian deliveries. Canada was not just selling corn, it was selling certainty, compliance, and a story that global buyers wanted to share with their customers. The US, meanwhile, faced a wave of rejections. By July 2025, shipments bound for Japan, South Korea, and parts of the EU were turned away over concerns about tariff disputes, GMO content, chemical residues, labeling inconsistencies, and the unpredictability of US trade policy. Some of these rejections were rooted in politics rather than actual quality defects. but perception in global markets matters as much as reality. In an environment where buyers prefer certainty over power, Canada was the supplier that checked every box. Even countries historically close to US markets began to hesitate. Mexico and the Philippines explored alternative suppliers, citing regulatory and labeling concerns. While US export sales data occasionally showed strong weeks, these numbers masked significant cancellations from key customers. Trust was eroding, and cancellations jeopardized not only current shipments but also the stability of future contracts. The broader picture is clear. Protectionist tariff policies, intended to strengthen US leverage in trade, have inadvertently accelerated a structural shift in global agricultural supply chains. Tariffs increased export costs, bottlenecks slowed shipments, and buyers found themselves with better options.